Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Greg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. I brought on Jonathan Lowy from Global Action on Gun Violence today to talk about, this is sort of a follow-up on one of my last episodes about going after the gun manufacturers with Tom DeMore. Tom recommended that I bring you on today, Jonathan, to get diving even deeper into this topic.
Yeah, great to be here, Greg.
And this is not just a, hey, listen to the show, be entertained, be informed. This is get involved. And a lot of people are just, with guns, they're despondent. What can they do? They've given up. The political process is dead. The Second Amendment has been butchered like nobody could have been butchered. So states can't pass legislation, even when the polling shows that the public wants stuff, they can't even get it on both sides. So Tom wrote an article in Law 360, showing that, hey, maybe there's another way to skin this cat, going after the gun manufacturers. So, Jonathan, let's talk about it. You are the founder and president of Global Action on Gun Violence, the only nonprofit organization working with the international community to reduce gun violence through litigation, advocacy, and messaging. And let's talk about the group, what you're doing, and what the gun manufacturers are doing that's so wrong. So let's first talk about a little bit about the group and what it's doing.
Sure. Well, first, a little background. I've been litigating against the gun industry for over 26 years, more than anyone in the country. And I spent the first 25 years of that, after 10 years in private practice, working at the Brady Center to prevent gun violence, and most of that was leading their legal team, and a lot of it was bringing lawsuits on behalf of victims and survivors of gun violence against gun manufacturers. And we certainly made some headway and had some good results, but ultimately, for all the reasons that you said, Greg, it was very frustrating, and there just wasn't really nearly enough progress. And I thought we needed to try new strategies, older strategies, and go outside of the constraining political dynamics in the U.S. Where you have there are issues like background checks that 90% of Americans support, and it's not the law. I mean, there's no example like that where you just have Congress refusing to do what the American people want. So I left Brady to create Global Action on Gun Violence to implement these new bold strategies on gun violence prevention, a lot of it using an international approach, working with members of the international community, and a lot of it is litigation. My organization, GAGV, represents the government of Mexico in one lawsuit. That's the first lawsuit brought by a country against gun manufacturers, and other lawsuits. The first lawsuit bring RICO claims against gun companies. We also are litigating a case in Canada against Smith & Wesson, and human rights action that I'll talk about as well. And all these are strategies that go outside of the political process of the U.S. And so I really believe they're bolder than we've seen domestically. And as a legal matter, there are special constraints that you have when you're suing gun companies in the U.S. because they have special protections under federal law that no other industry in America has. And by moving outside of the US, you can avoid some of those restrictions. So, that's what we're doing. We're active in the courts in the US, active in courts outside of the US, but also appearing in the United Nations, Organization of American States, international conferences to really bring the world community's pressure on the US and the US gun industry to finally address this massive crisis that we have of gun violence.
All right, so there's a lot of topics that you just kind of weaved into that one long sentence there. Immunity, international. So what's going on internationally? Why when we talk US gun manufacturers, is there an international component involved?
Well, a couple of things, but one is that as a result of the US weak US laws and reckless US gun industry practices, criminals in other countries, particularly ones near us, Mexico, Jamaica, Haiti, Canada, they can't get guns in their country because their countries have tough gun laws. So what they do is they, go to the US or work with traffickers in the US who could easily buy dozens of assault weapons and military sniper rifles, and then they traffic them to Mexico, to Haiti, to Jamaica, to Canada. And so the gun violence in those countries is largely a result of US policies and US industry practices. So, those other countries have a great interest in fixing our problem because it's their problem too.
So I looked at some of the statistics on your website or whatever, and it's just amazing how you of the gun manufacturers are essentially selling so many of the guns. And I guess it was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms found that 5% of the dealers are selling 90% of the crime guns. It's really a startling fact when you look at it. So it sounds like you're effectively getting these other countries on board with what you're doing. Some of them, at least.
Yeah, that's right. And what you said, Greg, about the numbers, it's really pretty astonishing. Um, with tobacco and opioids, it took a while for sort of the smoking gun, damning evidence to come out against those industries. With the gun industry, that smoking gun evidence has been staring us in the face for over 20 years. And that is that, over 20 years ago, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms said, almost all crime guns are sold by the small percentage of gun dealers. About 5% of dealers sell about 90% of crime guns. About 1% of gun dealers sell about 60% of crime guns. And, ATF said those dealers are using these reckless, if not illegal, practices where they're selling to straw purchasers and they're selling to gun traffickers who are buying guns in bulk. And then the federal government, Department of Justice, said to manufacturers, you've got to clean up your act and you should stop supplying these bad dealers. You should require your dealers to use safe practices. And manufacturers said, the hell with it. We're not going to do it. We're going to keep on doing exactly what we have been doing, knowing that it's supplying the criminal gun market. So, it's just extraordinary that you have this industry that just defies federal law enforcement for decades and gets away with it. And not only gets away with it, but then gets rewarded with special protections from Congress. And so, that is a problem. So you've got, Mexico and is the best example where they rightly recognize that the industry should not be able to get away with that. And Mexico is dealing with this massive problem of the drug cartels, which we in the U.S. are dealing with as well. By the way, the fentanyl crisis is driven to a large extent by the cartels in Mexico that are empowered by U.S. guns. If you stop the flow of U.S. guns across the border, the cartels could be put down. You wouldn't have the sort of, massive fentanyl problem that we've got here. The migration issue, that's driven by violence in Mexico, which is largely cartel violence using U.S. guns. So these are our laws, our industry, our practices causing problems not just in Mexico and throughout the region, also in the US. And the way you solve that problem most effectively, given the politics of the US, is go at the source, which is go at the manufacturers and get them to start behaving in a responsible way, like other industries do.
One of the other statistics, I think a lot of, and I'm just kind of presuming, but when I see the discussion like in the newspapers and on TV about the gun problems, it seems like people just like Second Amendment. Who are these people that are doing the killing? Let's solve it with mental health, which I have no problem with that. But that seems to be the entirety of the discussion. And your approach is to go, like you said, to go after the source, the gun manufacturers. I want to kind of, dive into how that would solve the problem, and then what you're doing on the human rights and the international things. One of the statistics that I got from your website, 60% of gun deaths in the world occur in Brazil, the United States, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Guatemala. That's it. And that's really just amazing to think about how the US gun manufacturers have so much of an impact. And,
Yeah.
before we get into, exactly what you're doing and tying in going after the gun manufacturers as a solution and how that would work and how you would make it work, I want to talk about this immunity, which we talked about with Tom DeMore. We touched on that briefly. The gun manufacturers have legal immunity. Why do they have legal immunity? What are they doing so wrong that they would go to Congress with their powerful lobbies and ask for immunity? No industry that I know of gets that kind of immunity. So obviously there must have been something that the public is really not even aware of. What are they doing wrong? And let's talk about that immunity.
Sure. The gun industry, uh, went to Congress in early 2000s and ultimately was successful in 2005 to get Congress to enact the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which we call PLCAA, which gives the gun industry special protection from civil liability that no other industry has. Of course, a lot of industries would love to have special protection, sort of get out of court free card. But tobacco didn't get it, opioids didn't get it. Doctors, they can get tort reform that limits damages. They don't get, a real immunity. But the gun industry was able to get that. There's a longer story about what sort of protection the industry gets, and that is debated in the courts. And I believe that PLCAA, for a bunch of reasons, should be interpreted in a narrow way to not give the industry sweeping protection. But the fact is, a lot of courts have ruled that, for one, gun manufacturers basically can't be liable for negligence, for not using reasonable care, unless they also violate a statutory law. And, of course, as Greg, that's the most fundamental principle of our civil justice system. negligence and to think that the industry that sells the most dangerous product on the consumer market, um, courts have found they can't be liable for negligently or recklessly, making and selling guns. That's pretty extraordinary, but that's what they got, and they got it, from their political clout, which is unique. And an important thing, not to go into all the politics of it, but there are other industries that have a lot more money than the gun industry in America. So when people talk about, oh, the NRA gives a lot of money to politicians. I mean, that's true, but again, they don't have the money of all sorts of industries that don't have the same political clout, and that's because the politics of the issue, which is unique to guns.
Yeah. And it's just sad that even though the polling shows people want universal background checks and, all these other basic protections, somehow or another, politics has trumped even that. Polling, which shows people want some of these basic protections or whatever, basic practices or whatever, we can't even, I mean, like logic is, forget about logic. So now we've eliminated politics from solving the problem. Forget about logic. Now we're going after the gun manufacturers. You talk about negligence. They have immunity from negligence under this, this immunity statute. Tell me the name of it again. I mean, it's so ridiculous. I think the people have to hear it just to believe how illogical it is.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's called Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, PLCAA, PLCAA. And to give you an example of how it works, I had a case years ago, where a gun dealer, basically a fugitive from justice who's prohibited from buying guns, goes into a gun store. A few minutes later, walks out of the gun store with a gun, having left $200, which was the purchase price, on the counter, and ends up walking down the street and killing someone who was just a stranger who was working, painting a store. So we sued the gun dealer, saying, well, at the very least, you either sold the gun to this person illegally, or at the very least, you were negligent and you let him leave his money on the counter and walk out with a gun, which you should not obviously be able to do if you use reasonable care. And the court, ultimately the Alaska Supreme Court, held that, well, if it was just negligence, that is, if this gun dealer just lets people walk into the store, pick out guns, walk out, they're not liable under PLCAA. It is federal law prohibits the gun dealer from being held liable. And I argued, well, if that's true, that means a gun dealer could literally put his guns on the sidewalk and say, here they are, knock on the door if you're interested in buying a gun, and here's a tin can to put money in, if you'd like to leave money. And yeah, I said, would you have no liability if a gun dealer did that? And the court essentially said, yep, under PLCAA, if a gun dealer did that, they're not violating any law, so they would not be liable.
Wow.
So
yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, finish
no,
up.
no, that's, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the gun manufacturers and what they're doing wrong. We talk about negligence. You made reference to the straw purchasing and the bulk sales. From what I understand, their marketing is really just off the charts, what they're doing to try to make sales and effectively making sales. So let's talk about their marketing. What's so problematic about their marketing?
Well, I mean, a few things. I mean, one, you see with assault weapons, which, as we all know from living in the U.S., in many of the most horrific mass shootings, the shooter, uses an assault weapon, AR-15 style assault weapon usually. And often these are young men, and the gun industry in many cases markets assault weapons really for the sort of person that fits the profile for a lot of these mass shooters. And they use like first person video game shooter graphics and social media. And in is famously in the Sandy Hook case, the manufacturer had a ad which said something like, "Get your man card reissued." So, like, it's prove if you're not confident in your masculinity, you can prove it by buying an assault weapon. And it's really so it gets at that that demographic of these mass shooters. So, it's bad enough that they're taking these military style weapons and just selling them to the general public without any sorts of restrictions. Now to even advertise to sort of attract a mass shooter profile, really pours gasoline on the fire. So that's one example. And another is on self-defense. The studies have shown for decades that if you bring a gun into your home, it is much more likely to be used against you and your family than in self-defense. It's could be used in suicide, could be domestic violence and unintentional shooting. It's very rare that it's actually used effectively in self-defense, and yet the industry markets handguns basically saying you need one to defend yourself without mentioning the truth, without mentioning that, in fact, it's more likely to put you at risk or endanger you than to protect you. To me, that's like if the tobacco industry, uh, marketed cigarettes as a cure for cancer, which even the tobacco industry did not do that.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what the gun industry does. And so they also market based on fear to really create this artificial demand for guns, knowing that they're usually going to be used to cause harm and not for good ends.
All right. So we got the gun manufacturers who are marketing to basically 18 to 20-year-old men. Basically, they're still boys and preying on their insecurities, and whatever else it is that they know is going to work. It also, from what I'm reading, the way they're designing the guns is also problematic and negligent. Let's talk about that. What's wrong with how they're designing guns?
Sure. I mean, well, both of the problems I just mentioned, the assault weapons and the handguns, they both have issues. I mean, one is that the assault weapons are designed in numerous ways to make it easier to kill large amounts of people in a short amount of time. Um, and that's what the assault weapon is all about, particularly when it's equipped with high capacity magazine that can shoot 15, 20, 30, 50, 75 or more rounds without reloading. So that's one problem. And then to even make it worse, they're often made in a way that they can easily be modified to fire fully automatically. Fully automatically, meaning you pull the trigger once and the gun keeps firing like a
Yeah.
machine gun.
Wow.
That is illegal to do unless you sell the gun under regulations under the National Firearms Act, which they don't do for assault weapons. So all of those design issues again make it more likely that the gun's going to be used in mass shootings. And then on the handgun side, there are all sorts of safety features that manufacturers could put in that they've known about for decades that would make it much more difficult, if not impossible, for like children to fire a gun if they get a hold of it, or for other unauthorized users to fire a gun, or if a thief steals a gun, they would not be able to shoot it or transfer it to others. And those are like personalized devices. The more sophisticated ones are what's known as smart guns, where there'd be some sort of like biometrics, like we have in our iPhone. You could have that on a gun, but there's also much more simple ones, just like a built-in lock, key operated lock that and its technology has been around for decades. It's been used effectively. You have in your gun, and then, you know, thief gets a hold of the gun, your kid gets a hold of the gun, they would not be able to fire it. And yet, manufacturers don't put those in. And also, there have even been incidents where people have tried to get those sorts of devices on the market, and they've really been punished. There was one gun dealer who, actually near where I live, a few years ago, and it was going to start selling a smart gun with these sophisticated technology that would prevent unauthorized users. The dealer then announced that he was getting death threats, that people threatened to burn down his store if he sold a smart gun. So he said, okay, I'm not going to sell it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of nasty stories about people being punished for trying to do the right thing.
And it looked like on your website, you talked about, with the safety features and safe business practices, it looked like in 2000, one major gun manufacturer agreed to implement the reforms and then reneged on it.
Yeah, and that really is an example of some of the great harm of PLCAA. So what happened is that this is before this federal PLCAA law was enacted. There were a number of lawsuits brought against gun manufacturers. I was co-counsel in many of them in the late 90s on behalf of New York City, Washington, D.C., Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Detroit, many others. And as a result of that, plus threats by the Clinton administration to bring its own federal lawsuit against the gun industry, yet Smith & Wesson agreed to a settlement. And Smith & Wesson agreed to a whole bunch of things, including they agreed that they would start selling, distributing their guns in a responsible way. They wouldn't be supplying these dealers who are selling all the crime guns. They would require that all their dealers have proper training, that they use safe sales practices. They wouldn't be selling assault weapons. They wouldn't be selling high capacity magazines, and they put in some of these safety features we talked about. So, the settlement was not perfect, but it addressed a lot of these problems. And then there was a boycott, and a lot of people suspected it was the NRA was behind it, of Smith & Wesson. It almost drove them into bankruptcy. And ultimately, Smith & Wesson just walked away from the deal. It was a binding settlement, but they walked away from it. George W. Bush became president, so the U.S. government did not, force Smith & Wesson to, Bush being a supporter of the gun industry, the U.S. did not force Smith & Wesson to abide by the agreement. And then later on, the Bush presidency, this federal protection law, PLCAA, is enacted, which takes all the pressure off of the gun industry. And not only at that time, not only do you have Smith & Wesson agree to that, but it was widely reported that Glock and Taurus, two other major manufacturers, were extremely close to getting on board. And I think it's likely that if PLCAA had not been enacted and there'd been an administration that continued to put pressure on the industry, you probably would have seen other manufacturers join Smith & Wesson, and then you may have had a whole industry reforming its business practices. But instead, the exact opposite happened, and then you had this law pass, which took the pressure off the industry. Smith and Wesson was allowed to walk away, and 25 years later, you've got the industry, acting even worse than it was back in 2000.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've established that although most people are focusing on the person that's using the guns to create all these, all this mass shootings or whatever, but the one thing that's really not getting any attention is the gun manufacturer. And so now I want to get into what you call the outside game. Your strategy on how to help the problem. I'm not going to say solve the problem. I don't think we're solving the problem anytime soon, but let's talk about the outside game. You mentioned the international effort, human rights. Let's get down to exactly what you're doing and how that can help.
Sure. So there's a lot. I won't go into all of it, but one aspect is litigation against the gun industry, and not just any litigation against the gun industry, but litigation on behalf of the government of Mexico, and we expect that this will expand to others. But we represent government of Mexico in one lawsuit against major gun manufacturers, and the theory in that case is a lot of what we've talked about already. That manufacturers are distributing, selling their guns in ways that they know are supplying the criminal market that is arming the cartels. They know that they're these bad apple dealers that are selling virtually all the crime guns. They know that there's these buying patterns where people are buying dozens of assault weapons and going back to stores where they'll go into the store, maybe buy 5, 10 assault weapons, come back a couple weeks later and buy another 5 or 10, and then come back a week or so later and buy another bunch, and and also buy thousands of rounds of ammunition. Buying patterns where any reasonable person would know that's a gun trafficker. They're buying those guns to illegally resell them, and yet the dealer does it, and the manufacturer chooses to supply that dealer. And so, theory is that that's negligent and also illegal. And also, it is illegal, in our view, to sell assault weapons that can be readily modified to fire automatically. So, and then also the marketing. I mean, there's marketing that's aimed at the Mexican market, the illegal Mexican market. There's a handgun that has Mexican sayings engraved on the gun. I mean, that is an illegal market. So all of that, that is the theory in that case. And the outside game approach, one reason it's important is Mexico is taking action that the U.S. government has failed to take. And the U.S. government, should have and could have brought similar suits against the gun industry, talked about it under President Clinton. They haven't even talked about it since then, and they certainly haven't taken that sort of action. So, that's one example. And we argue that PLCAA does not apply under principles of extraterritoriality, and also that it doesn't bar the case because we come under exceptions that are under PLCAA. But then we also have litigation we're existing in Canada that was brought in Canada for a shooting in Toronto where PLCAA does not apply. There's no question PLCAA does not apply because the case was brought outside of the U.S.
Yeah. And so so tell me about that case.
The Canada?
Yeah, the Canada case.
So the Canada case was a Smith and Wesson that was the case against Smith and Wesson. It was a gun that was stolen and then used in a mass shooting. And the argument is that the gun could have and should have been made with some of these safety features that would have prevented unauthorized use. So if you had either internal lock or smart gun technology, thief would not have been able to fire the gun. So that's a theory that is very difficult to succeed in under PLCAA, but it's now moving forward in Canada. And then in the Mexico cases, I mentioned the manufacturer case. We also have a case against gun dealers in Arizona, which is the first lawsuit to bring RICO counts against gun companies. So, I mean, all of those, they have great potential for one that they seek, broad liability, but also they're really bolder actions than you've seen, in the U.S. Because again, the government of Mexico is taking action that the U.S. has not taken.
So are these lawsuits like your typical lawsuit where you're asking for monetary compensation for either the person that's been injured or killed or their family?
That's part of it, but then another part of it is asking for injunctive relief. So, the government of Mexico, for example, asking for compensation for damages, also asking in both cases for court orders that essentially would require manufacturers and dealers to sell guns in more responsible, safer ways, in specific ways. So there is, compensation and injunctive relief.
All right. You also mentioned a human rights type of litigation, I guess, right? Explain what that would be about or what that is about.
Sure. Well, in November, we actually filed a human rights action, which we called a lawsuit for survival, on behalf of Manny and Patricia Oliver and their son Joaquin. Joaquin was killed in the Parkland High School gun massacre, and the case is brought in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is a body of the Organization of American States, and it argues it's against the United States. It argues that the United States gun policy is in violation of its human rights obligations under inter-American human rights law that is binding on the U.S. And that seeks a determination by the Inter-American Commission that the U.S. is in violation of international human rights law, and a statement that what the U.S. needs to do to be in compliance with that law. And I think that case is extremely important. One, because it will put new, really intense pressure on the U.S. to change its ways, because you have an international, if we're successful, we have an international body that is important to the U.S. in the OAS, which is our neighbors in this region, holding that the U.S. is in violation of law, violation of human rights law, and the U.S. rightly likes to be a leader in human rights issues in the region and around the world, and for the U.S. to be held in violation of human rights law, it really makes it difficult for U.S. to be a leader unless it keeps its own house in order, particularly on something that important. And also, I think that case is important because it reframes the gun debate from where it is now as this domestic policy dispute, and it transforms it into a human rights mandate. I mean, this isn't a policy dispute. It's just not permissible for a country to tolerate the repeated slaughter of its people. That's not allowed under international human rights law. And that's really what we're dealing with. So that is not a frame that we've talked about much in the gun debate over the past decades, but I think it's a compelling one, and it's true. Um, you know, you can't, just as a country can't, slaughter its people, is not allowed to do that. UN and others would step in. It also is not allowed to, tolerate that. And of course, U.S. gun laws are completely out of line with the rest of the world. Um, you know, every other comparable country has much, much, much stronger laws than we do. So, this isn't simply a result of the Second Amendment. It's not a result even of the fact that we have a lot of guns. It's a result of policy decisions that allow for, reckless gun practices.
Yeah. All right. So in that case, is the United States defending against that case? And
Well, we
what
just
defense?
filed it. We just filed it, so we're not at a stage where there's been, pleadings and responses or anything like that. But so we'll see where it goes, and some of it will depend on administrations. I'm sure it'll be interesting. I mean, certainly with the current administration, my senses, I'm not going to speak for them, but I think President Biden would agree with most of what we have in our complaint. So I do think it would be it will be interesting to see what the U.S. Says. I mean, President Biden has been extremely vocal about PLCAA, saying it's awful, and Biden has said if he could have one wish on gun issues, it would be to eliminate PLCAA and have the gun industry be held accountable. So, and he certainly, called for assault weapon ban, which is would things that would have prevented the Parkland shooting. So
Yeah.
it will be interesting to see how the U.S. responds.
Is there any case like that that's gone through that court where you can say, all right, here's a precedent. I can see what can happen if I win. You can tell I guess, are they judges that you're in front of? Is it one judge? Is it multiple judges?
They're commissioners. They're effectively judges, but they're commissioners. It's a commission rather than court. Um, there's an Inter-American Court which deals with disputes between nations, but when you have petitions by individuals, it's the commission. And there are examples. I mean, one example for the U.S. is the juvenile justice system, where you've had there were decisions by international human rights tribunals that aspects of the U.S. juvenile justice system and juvenile capital punishment violated human rights law, and that those decisions had an effect and were cited by both the Supreme Court in eliminating capital punishment for juveniles, and also by Congress in juvenile justice reform. So I mean, that is an example of where it's had an effect. I think it will have even more of an effect with the gun issue because it's a much larger problem, both in the United States, but also throughout, the region.
All right. So I started this program off by saying this is not an episode that you're going to be entertained or just informed, but I'm trying to generate an opportunity for you to get involved. And your Global Action on Gun Violence is a nonprofit, so I know you accept the group accepts donations. What else can, if somebody's out here and they're just so upset, and I know there's a lot of people that are so upset and they call their Congress, it goes nowhere. What else can they do through your group? Let's say through your group.
Sure. Well, there's a lot, but the first thing I would suggest is go to our website, which is actiononguns.org. And certainly you can donate to us if you are able and wish to, but also we have a petition in support of this lawsuit for survival. And you can click through, or it's actiononguns.org/survival, and you'll see the petition. If you sign the petition, share that with your friends. We're gathering signatures of people around the world, which ultimately we're going to share with the Inter-American Commission to show that there's global support for the idea that human rights are greater than gun rights, and that your right to live free from gunfire is more important. It should be respected more than a right to guns. So we already have signatures from people in over 15 countries and every continent except for Antarctica. But so we definitely would love for you to sign that, and you'll also be on our email list, and you can get updates about other actions you can take.
All right, so that's going to do it for this episode of Cut to the Chase with Jonathan Lowy from Global Action on Gun Violence. All of these, the petition, you can go through his website, but I'm also going to put all this stuff on my show notes so you can get involved in the way that Jonathan just discussed. I know there's a lot of other issues we probably missed, other cases. You know, the Remington case, I think, was pretty big, but I want to bring you back maybe in 6 months. You can give us an update on your efforts here. I applaud you from the bottom of my heart. A lot of other people are, they're despondent. I think, one of the big problems is that people just don't even see that the gun manufacturers are the source, and they're not so innocent. They're not just manufacturing guns. They're taking actions that are really just public nuisance. They're causing epidemics. I don't even know the right word, but I'm so upset about the whole thing. I don't know what to be more upset about, with what's going on in the world. But again, Jonathan, thank you for coming on. Good luck with everything. And that'll do it for this episode of Cut to the Chase. Like I said, I'm going to bring him back. So if you have any questions you want me to ask him, you know what to do. And also subscribe, rate, and review the show. Jonathan, go have a safe, productive day, all right?
Thank you. My pleasure, Greg.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.